The lawyer looked at my daughter-in-law and said 4 words. I will never forget for the rest of my life. You need to leave. She laughed at first. Actually laughed. Like it was a joke. Like a 63-year-old man in a grey suit carrying a leather briefcase had just walked into her living room to entertain her. She was sitting in my son's chair, the one he'd had since college, the one with the worn armrest on the right side. And she had her legs crossed and her coffee in hand, and the kind of smile on her face that I'd come to recognize over the past 4 years. That smile that said she already knew how everything was going to end. She didn't know anything. My name is Eugene Parrish. I spent 31 years as a federal investigator with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, which sounds boring until you understand what it actually means. It means I spent 3 decades watching people who thought they were untouchable get very, very touched. Fraud artists, tax cheats, people who moved money through shell companies and offshore accounts and thought the paper trail ended somewhere it didn't. It never ends somewhere it doesn't. That's the first thing you learn in this work. Everything leaves a trace. Everything. I retired at 61. My wife Miriam had passed 2 years before that, ovarian cancer, and after she was gone, the job started to feel hollow in a way I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't lost their person. So I retired. I moved from our house in Arlington to a smaller place in Charlottesville, close to where my son Elliot was living with his wife. Elliot was 34. He'd grown up watching me work cases, and he'd inherited whatever gene makes a person relentlessly curious about why things don't add up. He became a forensic accountant. We used to joke that the apple didn't fall far. We had dinner every Sunday at a rotisserie place on Water Street that neither of us could afford to love as much as we did, and we talked about everything. His work, my retirement, the Nationals, whether I was eating enough. He was the kind of son who checked on his father and didn't make it feel like checking. His wife, I'll call her Amber because that's her name, had come into the picture about 4 years before any of this happened. She was attractive in the way that makes people overlook things they shouldn't overlook. Charismatic at parties. Good at first impressions. She laughed at everyone's jokes and remembered everyone's birthdays, and the first time I brought Miriam's ring out to show her. Because Elliot had asked if he could give it to her, she cried in a way that seemed real. I want to be fair. I want to be accurate. The truth is that for the first year or so, I didn't dislike Amber. I was cautious the way a father is cautious, but I didn't dislike her. What changed was gradual. Small things at first. The way she'd steer conversations away from Elliot's finances when I was in the room. The way she started coming to Sunday dinners less, and then not at all, with explanations that were just slightly too detailed to be spontaneous. Elliot never complained. He was the kind of man who smoothed things over because he hated the alternative, hated the friction, hated the idea of the people he loved not getting along. So he'd say she was tired or she had a work thing, and I'd nod and we'd eat our chicken and talk about baseball. Then Elliot got sick. It started as something he called just fatigue. He'd always been healthy. Ran 5 days a week, didn't drink much, had the blood work of someone 10 years younger. But in the spring of last year, he started losing weight and sleeping 12 hours and getting winded on stairs that hadn't bothered him in years. By June, he'd seen 3 doctors. By August, the word lymphoma entered our lives and immediately rearranged everything inside it. The diagnosis was serious, but not, they said, unsurvivable. There was a treatment plan. There was optimism. I drove him to his first infusion and sat in the chair next to him for 4 hours. And we watched a terrible action movie on my laptop, and I held it together until I got to my car in the parking garage, and then I didn't hold it together at all. Amber's response to the diagnosis was something I watched carefully, the way I'd spent 30 years watching things carefully. She asked the right questions at the right times. She used the right words, but there was something underneath it, a quality I can only describe as calculation. that I noticed and filed away and hoped I was wrong about. I was not wrong about it. 6 weeks into Elliot's treatment, I called his cell phone on a Tuesday afternoon to check in. Amber answered. "He's resting," she said. "I'd love to just hear his voice for a minute," I said. "He's really exhausted, Eugene. The treatment is hard on him." I said I understood. I said to tell him I called. I sat in my kitchen in Charlottesville and looked at the wall for a while. That evening, Elliot texted me. He said he hadn't known I called. He said Amber told him she'd forgotten to pass the message along. I started keeping notes after that, old habit. In October, Elliot had a scan that showed the lymphoma responding to treatment. The oncologist used the phrase cautiously optimistic. We celebrated at the rotisserie place, just the two of us, because Amber had a work event and Elliot seemed lighter than he had in months. He was laughing. He ordered the extra side of roasted potatoes. He talked about a hiking trip he wanted to take in the spring. Maybe the Shenandoah. Maybe just an overnight. Nothing crazy. He looked like himself again. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The call came at 6:14 in the morning on a Thursday in November. Amber's voice was flat in a way that didn't match the words she was saying. She said Elliot had gone to bed complaining of chest tightness, and when she woke up in the morning he was gone. Cardiac event, she said. She'd already called 911. He was already gone by the time they arrived. I drove to Richmond. They'd moved there 2 years earlier, in a state that I cannot fully describe. Not grief, not yet. Something that lives underneath grief. Something cold. When I got to their house, there was a car in the driveway I didn't recognize. A silver Lexus. Amber met me at the door and told me the house was a private space right now and that she'd been in contact with the funeral home and everything was being handled. I asked to come inside. She said not yet. I stood on the porch of my son's house while my son's body was presumably still inside it. I drove to a Perkins 2 miles away and sat in a booth and drank coffee until noon. I called Elliot's best friend from college, a man named Davis who lived in Richmond and had known Elliot for 15 years. Davis had already heard. He was crying on the phone in a way that made me feel less alone and more terrified at the same time. Davis said he'd tried to visit Elliot 3 weeks earlier and Amber had told him Elliot wasn't feeling up to visitors. He said Elliot had texted him separately that same evening, from the bathroom, Davis thought, based on the strange timing, saying he was actually fine and that he'd explain later. There was no later. That night, from my hotel room, I wrote down everything I knew. The silver Lexus, the blocked visit, the blocked phone call, the text from the bathroom, the way Amber had sounded on the phone that morning, the way she'd spoken about the lymphoma from the beginning, not as something happening to her husband, but as something happening around her. I wrote it all down, and I looked at it, and I thought, I have spent 31 years making cases. I know what a case looks like when it's starting. Elliot's body was cremated 4 days later. Amber moved quickly on that. I had asked through the funeral home whether we could have a few more days. Amber had declined. I did not have legal standing to intervene. The cremation was done before I could do anything about it. What I could do, what I did do immediately, was contact a physician I'd worked with on a case 8 years earlier, a forensic pathologist in Northern Virginia named Dr. Whitfield. I called her and told her what I knew. She told me that in a case where cremation had already occurred, the window for proving foul play narrowed dramatically, but wasn't entirely closed if blood had been drawn at the hospital before the body was prepared. She said I could request those labs. I requested them through a personal injury attorney I knew in Arlington. The request went in. The wait began. In the meantime, Amber called me. It was the Friday after the cremation. She was pleasant on the phone in that overdone way that sets off every alarm I have. She said she wanted me to know that she was taking care of everything and that she'd be in touch about a memorial service. Then she said something that I wrote down verbatim the moment we hung up. She said, "Elliot had a substantial estate, as I'm sure you know, and I want you to hear it from me directly. that everything is going to be managed appropriately. I've already spoken to a financial advisor. I want you to know you don't need to worry about any of that. I wasn't worried about that. I was worried about my son being dead at 34. But she'd felt the need to bring it up, unprompted, 4 days after his cremation. She'd felt the need to tell me not to worry about something I hadn't expressed any concern about. I started worrying about it. Elliot had done well. The forensic accounting work paid more than people expected, and he'd had investment accounts since his late 20s, something I'd pushed him toward early, something Miriam had helped him start. The estate wasn't enormous by some standards, but it wasn't small. A house in Richmond worth somewhere close to $400,000. A retirement portfolio. A life insurance policy he'd taken out when they got married with a payout of $800,000. $800,000. I called the attorney in Arlington again. Then I called a different attorney, an estate litigator in Richmond named Mr. Kowalski, who came recommended by a former colleague. I told Mr. Kowalski everything. The timeline, the silver Lexus, the blocked communications, the cremation, the phone call with Amber, and what she'd said about the estate. Mr. Kowalski listened to all of it. Then he asked me one question. Do you know if your son had a will? I told him I didn't know. We'd talked about it once, maybe 2 years ago, and Elliot had said he was going to get something drafted. I didn't know if he had. Mr. Kowalski said he'd make some inquiries. 3 days later, he called me back. He said yes, there was a will. He said it had been filed with a probate attorney in Richmond. He said a reading had been scheduled for the following Thursday at the home of the deceased, per a specific request in the will itself. The home. Elliot's home. Amber's home now, in her mind. I asked Mr. Kowalski if I was named in the will. He said he wasn't able to tell me that yet, but he said the fact that I'd been notified of the reading was itself meaningful. The Thursday reading was 8 days away. During those 8 days, I did what I had spent 31 years training myself to do. I built a file. I gathered what I could gather. I got the hospital blood labs through the attorney. They were partial, not comprehensive, but they showed Elliot's potassium levels at the time of arrival had been flagged as irregular. Not definitive, but irregular. I sent them to Dr. Whitfield. She told me the irregularity could be consistent with several things, including natural cardiac event. She also told me it could be consistent with other things. She said she couldn't say more than that without more data, and the data was ash. I also found out who owned the silver Lexus. It took me 4 days, and 2 favors from former colleagues, both of whom asked no questions and made no comments. The Lexus was registered to a man I'll call by first name only, Garrett. He was 31. He worked in real estate in the Richmond metro area. He had been, according to 2 separate people I spoke with who knew them both, in a relationship with Amber for an unknown period of time. I don't know when it started. I may never know, but I know the car was in that driveway the morning my son's body was still inside the house. I know that. The Thursday morning of the reading, I put on the same suit I'd worn to Elliot's memorial service. I drove to Richmond. I sat outside the house in my car for 20 minutes because I needed to be calm when I walked in. And calm was not the natural state of a man in my position on that particular morning. When I went inside, Amber was in the living room with her sister and a woman I didn't recognize. She smiled at me with the careful smile of someone performing graciousness they don't feel. She offered me coffee. I declined. I sat in the chair nearest the door, not the armchair where she'd been sitting, Elliot's chair, because I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of telling me to move. The attorney arrived at 10 o'clock. His name was Mr. Fairbanks, and he was the probate attorney who had filed Elliot's will. He was a quiet man, methodical, with reading glasses on a cord around his neck. He set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it, and removed a document and put his glasses on. Amber was already smiling in a particular way. The way someone smiles when they believe the story is already over. Mr. Fairbanks looked up from the document. He looked at Amber. He looked at her sister. He looked at the woman I didn't recognize. He said, "I need to clarify the attendance for this reading. The will specifies that only named beneficiaries and their designated representatives may be present." Amber said, "Of course." Mr. Fairbanks said, "You are not named in this will." The room went very quiet. Amber's smile didn't disappear immediately. It took a moment, like her face hadn't gotten the message yet. "I'm sorry," she said. "Mrs. Parrish," Mr. Fairbanks said, "you are not a named beneficiary in your husband's will, neither is your sister, nor," he glanced at the third woman, "any additional guests. I'll need to ask you to step outside while I conduct the reading with the named party." Amber stood up. Her coffee cup was still in her hand. "That's not possible. I'm his wife. I'm entitled. Virginia law does provide certain statutory protections for a surviving spouse," Mr. Fairbanks said, calmly, without looking up from the document. "Your attorney can advise you on those provisions. For the purposes of this reading, you are not named, and I have to ask you to step out." I watched her face do something I can only describe as collapse and reassemble at the same time. The graciousness was gone. The calculation was visible for a moment, raw and unguarded, and then she smoothed it back over and picked up her purse and walked out without looking at me. Her sister followed. The third woman followed. The front door closed. Mr. Fairbanks looked at me and said, "Mr. Parrish, shall we proceed?" I said yes. Elliot had updated his will 11 months before he died. Not after the diagnosis, before it. He'd gone to Mr. Fairbanks the previous December, when the marriage was apparently already something he was reconsidering in private, and he had restructured everything. The house, which was in his name alone, he'd purchased it before they married and never changed the deed. Went to me, with the stipulation that proceeds from any sale be directed to a scholarship fund in Miriam's name at the University of Virginia. The retirement accounts named me as primary beneficiary, a designation he'd apparently never changed from when he first opened them, and which Amber had, according to Mr. Fairbanks, asked him to update on 3 separate occasions. He hadn't updated them. The life insurance policy was the one I hadn't anticipated. He'd taken it out when they married and initially named Amber. But 13 months ago, he had called the insurance company and changed the beneficiary designation to me. The $800,000. Mr. Fairbanks handed me a letter. It was in Elliot's handwriting, his actual handwriting, not typed, the slightly left-leaning print he'd had since grade school. He'd left it with Mr. Fairbanks at the December meeting, sealed, with instructions to give it to me at the reading. I won't reproduce what it said. Some things belong only to the people they were written for. But I will tell you that my son had seen clearly, far more clearly than I'd given him credit for. He'd seen the Lexus, or something like it. He'd seen the blocked visits and the redirected phone calls and the quality of calculation underneath the performance. He was a forensic accountant. He knew how to read patterns. He knew how to follow a trail. He'd done what he could do with the tools available to him. He protected what he could protect. At the end of the letter he'd written, "Dad, you always said everything leaves a trace. I left you mine." I sat in that room for a long time after Mr. Fairbanks left. Just sat there, in the quiet of my son's house, with a letter in my hands. The grief was enormous. It had been enormous since November, and it was going to be enormous for a long time to come. Nobody tells you that justice and grief are not the same thing, that one doesn't cure the other, that you can win something and still have lost everything that mattered. But there was something else there too, underneath the grief, something that felt like Elliot, like he'd been sitting in that room with me, like he'd gotten the last word. The legal aftermath took months. Virginia's elective share statute gave Amber the right to claim a portion of the estate regardless of the will, and she exercised it. Her attorney filed within the statutory window. Mr. Kowalski handled it. The elective share calculation in Virginia is based on the length of the marriage and other factors, and the amount she ultimately received was a fraction of what she had anticipated. A small fraction. I cooperated fully with the Richmond Police Department when they opened an inquiry into the circumstances of Elliot's death. I gave them the lab report Dr. Whitfield had flagged. I told them about the Lexus. I told them about Garrett. They spoke with Amber. They spoke with Amber. They spoke with Amber. I don't know everything that inquiry produced, because I'm not entitled to know everything, but I know it is still open. I know her name is still in a file somewhere. Everything leaves a trace. Everything. I sold the Richmond house in the spring. The proceeds, after legal costs, went to the scholarship fund. The first award will go out next fall, a grant for a first-generation college student studying accounting or finance at UVA. Miriam would have had something dry and funny to say about the accounting part. I can almost hear her. On Sunday mornings, I still go to Water Street sometimes. I get the chicken. I sit in the booth by the window. I watch the street, and I drink my coffee, and I let myself miss him fully, without managing it, without holding it back. He was 34 years old. He was smart and careful and kind, and he loved his father enough to spend a December afternoon in a lawyer's office making sure his father was protected. That's who he was. I don't need anything else to be true about him. That's enough. I keep thinking about the December afternoon when Elliot drove to Mr. Fairbanks's office and sat down and quietly rewrote everything. He didn't call me. He didn't ask for advice. He just went and did it alone because he understood something that I hadn't given him enough credit for understanding. He saw what was happening around him clearly, and he acted on what he saw. That kind of clarity, the ability to look at something painful and still think straight, still make good decisions, still protect the people you love even when you're afraid, that doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from character that was built over a long time, one quiet choice at a time. People ask me sometimes, now that this is all behind me, what I think the real lesson is. I never quite know how to answer that, because I don't think there's one lesson. There are several, and they're tangled together. The first is about integrity. Amber made a calculation. She looked at my son and saw an asset, and she structured her behavior around extracting that asset. And for a while it worked. The performance was convincing. But integrity isn't something you can fake indefinitely. It leaks. It showed in the way she spoke on the phone the morning he died. It showed in the Lexus in the driveway. It showed in every small moment where the mask slipped just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Amber's problem wasn't that she was unlucky. It was that she was, at her core, dishonest. And dishonesty has a way of leaving exactly the kind of traces she never planned for. The second is about clear thinking. Elliot was in the middle of cancer treatment. He was exhausted and frightened, and he had every reason to go soft, to avoid conflict, to tell himself everything was probably fine. He didn't. He looked at the pattern of behavior around him, and he followed it to its logical conclusion, and he took action. That's not instinct. That's discipline. The same kind of discipline I spent 31 years trying to apply to my own work. I learned it on the job. He learned it watching me, I think, though we never talked about it in those terms. Knowing what you know and acting on it, even when the truth is uncomfortable, that's the thing that saved what he wanted to save. The third is about endurance. I sat in a Perkins off the highway and drank bad coffee and did not fall apart. I drove back and forth to Richmond more times than I can count. I waited for lab results and legal filings and phone calls that took weeks. Grief does not pause for logistics. You carry them at the same time. There's no other option. And the carrying, the willingness to stay in the difficulty long enough to see it through, that's what made the difference between Elliot's wishes being honored and them being swallowed up by someone who counted on me giving up. He wrote at the end of that letter, "Everything leaves a trace." He was right. The trace he left was a document in a lawyer's briefcase and a scholarship fund with his grandmother's name on it and a Sunday booth at a restaurant on Water Street, where I still go and still miss him in the fullest way I know how. That's the trace that matters. That's the one that lasted.